The quiet whisper of the trees, interrupted only by the muffled sound of footsteps, echoed like solitary sand scattered in an endless sea. The forest where they had set up camp was eerily silent. It was that kind of silence where every branch, every leaf, every gust of wind seemed to hold meaning. The depth of the forest didn't just absorb the sounds, but the light as well, making it feel like this forest wasn't just a natural formation, but part of something alive, something that was watching them, something that never slept. With every step, the feeling intensified. Someone was watching. They didn't pay much attention to it. This was their first big camping trip, a young couple who decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city, to reconnect with nature, to restore their bond with the earth. But the night that approached was not what they had imagined. Nature was neither friendly nor peaceful. It was cold, unforgiving, and seemed devoid of mercy. Their camp was located at the edge of the forest, far from any trails, a place where even wild animals rarely ventured. It was supposed to be the perfect spot for a retreat, away from civilization. But from the very first night, something was wrong. The moon was high in the sky, and Lauren, the girl who had come on this trip with her husband, felt her body adjusting to the cold that slowly seeped into the tent. Her husband was tending the fire, trying to create some warmth. "Do you hear that?" Lauren asked, not taking her eyes off the flames. Roman shook his head, not looking up from the fire. "It's just the forest. Don't worry." Lauren felt a chill run down her spine. She silently scanned the forest surrounding them, like massive walls that offered no escape. She was determined to feel safe in this secluded place, but her gut feeling of anxiety wouldn't go away. "It's not just the wind," she said, trying to hide the fear in her voice. "It's something else." Roman furrowed his brow and lifted his annoyance in his eyes. "Lauren, are you serious? It's just the sounds of the forest. You read too much fantasy. You have nothing to fear." She silently looked at him, but could feel the sounds from the forest growing more and more like human footsteps. They weren't the usual sounds, the rustling of leaves or creaking branches, but like someone moving very quietly, trying not to attract attention. Roman didn't hear it, but she was stubborn. She always sensed when something was off. And now that sense of unease, as if someone was watching them, was stronger than ever. They sat by the fire when the sound came again. A low, raspy noise like something heavy moving through the trees, and it was much closer now than before. There was no wind. Lauren and Roman both turned their heads toward the forest. Roman, usually calm, started to grow nervous. "Do you hear that now?" Lauren whispered, her voice full of frustration. He didn't answer. He just stood up, staring into the darkness that swallowed the forest. The fire flickered, casting erratic shadows on the surrounding trees. "I'm going to check it out," he said, his doubts gone. Lauren shivered. She didn't want to be left alone. She couldn't explain why, but she was terrified. "Roman, maybe you shouldn't." He didn't respond, just moved into the darkness. Lauren stayed by the fire, her heart racing. She tried to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the sounds didn't stop, and the more she listened, the more real they became. Suddenly, amidst the silence of the forest, she heard his voice. He sounded surprised, almost scared. "Lauren! Lauren, are you there?" His voice was too distant. Lauren jumped to her feet and ran toward the voice. She didn't understand what was happening, but there was a terrible emptiness in her chest. Each step in the dark felt endless. Something had happened. Something definitely had happened. When she finally reached Roman, he stood among the trees, his head tilted upward, frozen in place. "What's wrong?" Lauren whispered. Roman didn't respond. She moved closer, and then she saw his eyes. His pupils had rolled back, and he was trembling. Slowly, Lauren lifted her gaze in the direction Roman had been staring. Above them, on the dark branches, something was there. Something with glowing eyes like those of animals at night. It was watching her. Slowly, it descended toward them. This was no animal, no forest predator. It was something that would not give them a chance to escape. Lauren wanted to scream, but she couldn't. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. The creature slowly reached her and landed on the ground, just an arm's length away. Its predatory eyes locked onto hers. She couldn't resist. She stood still, staring into its eyes. The creature grabbed her husband like he was a rag doll and with a single swipe, threw his body onto its back. It dragged him into the depths of the forest, leaving Lauren standing there. As soon as the creature disappeared into the darkness with her husband, Lauren collapsed to her knees, her heart pounding. What? What was that? Why did it take her husband? What should she do? A mountain of questions attacked her mind. Lauren couldn't believe her eyes. Her consciousness began to fade. She awoke in her tent. The sun was shining through the fabric. Through the opening in the tent, she saw Roman preparing something over the fire. Oh my God, it was just a dream, Lauren whispered. Are you awake already? Breakfast is ready, Roman said. Lauren jumped out of the tent and rushed to embrace her husband. She had thought she would never see him again, but it was just a dream. I had a horrible nightmare, Lauren said. A nightmare, Roman said, and half of his face froze into a grimace. We had always heard the old tales about forests and paths that lead to places you shouldn't tread. But as often happens, with youthful enthusiasm, we didn't heed such warnings. I was on a hike with my friends south of the mountains, in a small campsite by the woods. We set out on this journey with the naive goal of enjoying nature and testing ourselves. That evening, the sun was already sinking below the horizon, and the forest was sinking into thick darkness. We were walking down an old, almost forgotten trail, overgrown with moss and fallen leaves. The deeper we ventured, the more my anxiety grew. The air became heavier, and the path gradually faded into the underbrush. We silently listened to the forest. It seemed like there was a dead silence around us, but every now and then, the wind would carry distant sounds that resembled whispers. We stumbled upon something that made us stop. Right before us, in the middle of a small clearing, stood an old wooden chapel. It was abandoned, its walls eaten by time, and the roof had rotted to the point where the dark sky peeked through. One of us joked that it looked like a scene from a horror movie, but no one laughed. Mark, the bravest of us, suggested we look inside. We hesitated, but in the end, we all followed him. Inside, the silence was so oppressive that every breath we took seemed too loud. Broken pieces of wood, old candle stubs, and what looked like remnants of animal bones littered the floor. The smell of decay hung in the air, as if someone had died here not long ago. In the center stood a tarnished statue of a saint, its face so worn that it seemed like it had been deliberately scraped away. I felt that we shouldn't be here. Everything about this place screamed danger. I turned toward the exit, and at that moment, I heard Mark's strangled scream. We turned around. He was standing by a broken altar, staring into a dark hole beneath it. There was something down there. He jerked back, but it was too late. Someone had grabbed his leg. A hand shot out from the crack, thin, with long fingers. It grabbed his leg and yanked him down. Mark screamed, trying to break free, but an invisible force pulled him down with such strength that we couldn't react in time. He reached for the edge of the altar, but his fingers slipped and he vanished into the darkness, leaving only the dull echo of his scream behind. We ran for the exit, not looking back. We dashed through the forest, tripping, falling, but not stopping. The darkness grew thicker, like ink, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was following us. The trees around us closed in, and every step we took echoed, but it wasn't only our footsteps. When we finally reached civilization, none of us could speak a word. We went to the police. They didn't believe us, but they organized a search operation anyway. But Mark was never found. What's more, that chapel was gone. The forest was solid, with no clearings, no structures. It was as if it had never existed. Months passed, but every night I wake up because I feel like I hear that same scream. I don't know what happened that day, but one thing I know for sure is there are places you're better off not entering, because even if you escape, they will still find you. When I set out on this hike, I had no idea what to expect. It was a simple hike, a quest to find peace in the mountains, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. I had never been to these remote parts of the country before, but I had hoped to find something real, to find inner peace again. It was spring, and the whole world seemed to be coming alive again, full of hope for new beginnings. My goal was simple, to spend a few days in the mountains south of my hometown and then return. The first few days went well. The light breeze, The singing of birds and the incredibly clean air made this place ideal for relaxation. I wandered along the trails, took long walks to the rivers, and swam across small lakes, enjoying every moment. In the mountains, it was easy to forget about time and responsibilities, to immerse myself in nature completely. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just trying to escape from the boring reality. But that all changed one night. I was standing by my tent when I heard something unusual. At first, I didn't pay attention. It could have been the wind playing with the branches of the trees or some animal looking for food. But with each passing minute, the sounds became clearer. They were voices. And not just voices, but whispers that reached me from the darkness. I returned to the tent, trying not to pay attention. It was important to remain calm because it was only an impression. But the longer I stood there, the more I felt this feeling of anxiety growing in my chest, consuming me. I heard footsteps approaching me. They were not human footsteps. They were vague movements, soft, inaudible, as in a dream. I took my flashlight and stepped out into the darkness. I walked a few meters from the camp, looking for the source of this terrible sound. And then I saw them. Shadows. They were not moving, but they were there, in the darkness. As I approached, one of the shadows raised its head. It was not a human face, but some kind of distorted, blurred face that could not be clearly made out. The body was human-like, but with serious deformities. I felt fear squeezing me. This was not a natural phenomenon. There was no one I could explain. I stood as if spellbound, looking at these shadows that appeared closer and closer. As if I began to forget where I was and what I was doing here among them. While I still had the remnants of consciousness, I decided to go back and was about to run, but I could not. I heard that whisper again, but not from behind, but right in my head. I felt a chill down my spine. These were not just voices, but thoughts, other people's thoughts, intertwined with mine. They were shouting at me something I couldn't understand. I turned around, trying to walk calmly, but my feet wouldn't listen. I lowered my flashlight, and in its light I saw them following me, slowly without touching the ground. My consciousness tried to escape, but I was chained to this place. At that moment I understood. I was not alone in these mountains, not alone in this reality. The next night I didn't sleep. I heard their whispers all night. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't leave. It was more than fear. It was the impossibility of choice. I couldn't leave this camp. I couldn't leave the mountains. They were inside me. I was part of something bigger. The sun came up and I noticed, and the whispering subsided. It was as if they had left me for a while. I thought about leaving, but my feet wouldn't move. Every time I try to leave this camp, but the road takes me back. Again and again I looked for a way to escape, but nothing helped. In despair, I fell to the ground and began to pray. I pressed my hands to my face, but the fingers were not mine. I looked at my hands. The fingers from their very tips became some kind of black, translucent as if they were made of some kind of smoke. Frozen, I watched as this darkness spread over my limbs. Less and less of what was human remained in me. Now I too will be such a shadow. We set out on our journey with a simple goal: to find what had long disappeared from the maps, an abandoned city that was part of this forgotten history. I felt excitement mixed with fear, for such places always hold their dark secrets. As we ventured deeper into the forest, we encountered the place where time seemed to have stopped. But it was that moment, when we left the last village behind, that our journey truly began, marking a turning point. The light breeze in the forest and the indistinct sound echoing from tree to tree created an atmosphere where every noise seemed foreign and strange. Legends about this camp had been circulating for a long time. People who tried to find it always returned without success. And while many thought it was just an old rumor that this place still existed, I couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. I had always been drawn to the idea of finding a place that had long been forgotten. I convinced my friend Thomas, who was my old schoolmate, to join me. Our plan was simple: find the forgotten camp, spend a few nights there, and gather material for my blog. For the first few days, we walked along forest paths, crossing rivers and narrow roads. And although we were getting closer to the spot that According to rumors, could be the very camp. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had forgotten something. At night, the forest felt more alive, but we were no strangers to long hikes, and it would be hard to scare us. Finally, we reached the approximate location and decided to set up camp and continue searching the surroundings. The camp had to be somewhere nearby. The discovery didn't take long. We found the spot and it looked eerie. Remnants of buildings, fallen trees, nature had taken over everything. Rusted swings and discarded belongings. And although it appeared to be just another abandoned settlement, deep within this silence, something felt wrong. Thomas started investigating an old fence that stood in the shade of the trees, and his face changed. He became pale and terrified. Someone is here, he whispered, stepping back from the fence. I stepped closer and immediately felt the air around us become thick, heavy. Suddenly we heard whispering, quiet but distinct, as if very close. Our hearts clenched. In a forest where we hadn't seen a single living soul, we heard children's voices. How was that possible? Then we heard rustling in the grass and footsteps, as if someone was running between the buildings. We commanded each other not to panic, but fear quickly took hold of us. This place had been off limits to tourists for over 20 years due to a horrific tragedy, a landslide that claimed the lives of 9 children, whose bodies were never found. And now these voices, whispering. We hurried back to our tent, but the forest grew even more hostile, and the children's whispers grew louder and louder. Thomas tripped and fell. I helped him up, and my hand pulled him toward the camp, but the footsteps didn't stop. Someone was running after us, small, fast, and certainly not alone. Looking over my shoulder, I saw no one. But this fear, it just squeezed my heart. We could have tried to figure out how the children could be here, but where could they have come from? The nearest normal road was 2 days' walk away. We ran, stumbled, got up, and ran again. It was as if someone was deliberately wearing us down. We had no more strength to flee. We just started screaming, shouting for them to leave us alone, that we wouldn't disturb them anymore. The footsteps faded, the whispering stopped, and they left us in peace. Each of us has a dream. For me, it was exploring old, abandoned places. What happened that summer I couldn't forget. I thought the abandoned camp we found was just ruins from the past, but it turned out to be the place that took Clara. Clara, my friend, an explorer with a thirst for adventure, and I set off for the national park in search of an abandoned camp that was only marked on old maps. The place was full of legends, and although most had forgotten about it, we were eager to find it. The warnings of the locals seemed exaggerated to us, and the stories of disappearances seemed like fiction. We went out to the place where the camp should have been by all indications. Silence was the first thing that struck us. Not a sound of birds, not a rustle of wind in the branches. Only our own footsteps sounded strangely muffled. There were half-ruined buildings on the lawn, the wooden frames of former tents, the remains of stoves, the grass-covered places of bonfires. All this spoke of the fact that there had once been life here, but it had ended. Clara was examining the charred remains of the hearth, and I came across a structure that looked like a former warehouse or dining room. It was old, blackened by time, but the door remained closed. I was about to call Clara when I noticed that she was already looking at this building. Her face was tense. "Strange," she said. "Do you hear that?" I listened, and indeed there was a dull, barely perceptible rustling. Not the wind, not an animal, something crawling. Clara was the first to go to the door and push it open. The door creaked as it opened. The smell of dampness and decay hit my nose. Inside, everything was covered in mold. The wooden floor was cracked. In the corners lay old things that might once have belonged to the people who lived here. And then we heard a sound, as if something was moving under the floor. Clara rushed forward, illuminating the dark space with a flashlight. There's something there," she whispered. I came closer and saw a gap in the floor in the corner, as if someone had deliberately crushed the boards, forming a passage into the darkness. The smell from there was stronger, thick, rotten. "Get out of here," I said, but Clara had already stepped closer, and we heard the rustling under the boards again. A hand protruded from the darkness of the hole, long, thin, almost bony, covered with dirty, cracked skin, with impossibly long fingers. She clung to the edge of the opening, and then her head appeared. Her hair hung in tatters from her skull, and her eyes, they were empty, dark, like pits. Clara froze, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Then it jumped out abruptly and grabbed her by the leg. Clara screamed and began to fight back, but this creature was stronger. I rushed to it, grabbed its arms, trying to pull it out, but it dragged it down. I received a sharp blow to my head. It froze, and I fell to the floor, letting go of Clara. Clara kicked, digging her fingers into the wooden floor. I tried to get up, and then the creature raised its head. Its empty eyes stared at me. I don't know what I saw in that look, but my heart pounded in my chest so much that I couldn't breathe. Fear gripped me like ice. Clara slid down, gasping for air. Her fingers slipped from the floor. The last thing I heard was her desperate scream, and then the sound died away. Silence. I don't know how long I stood there staring into the black hole. I waited for her to speak. I waited for her hand to appear again and grab me, begging for help. But nothing happened. I took a step back, then another step. Cold sweat covered my body. There was only one thought in my head. I had to run. I turned and ran out of the building without looking back. I ran through the forest until I got to the road, until I saw people. When I returned here with the rescuers, the building was still standing. I showed and told everything that had happened. Pointed to the abyss in the tunnel. The floor was quickly dismantled, but there was no trace of Clara. I had a series of unpleasant interrogations and a whole bunch of problems after that story. But what if my problems were compared to what Clara felt at that moment? I was scared. I left her. I hate myself for it. No one believed me, but I remember. I remember her scream and that look that made me leave her there. I haven't been back to the forest since, but sometimes it seems to me that I can still hear her scream, somewhere in the darkness.